Before we continue on, I'd like to offer a quick tangent about dungeon order, since it's a question I've gotten a lot. After completing Southern Ruins and rescuing Minister Left, we're actually given pretty much free reign of exploration in Hyrule, and the choice between two dungeons to tackle next: the Gerudo Sanctum to the west, and Jabul Ruins to the east. The choice of dungeon order will present itself again later on in the game, so just like with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I made sure to consider as many factors as I could to settle on a dungeon order for this video series. In the end though, the answer lies in two places. The first indicator is found in the game's files, which actually number the dungeons. Second is the game's playable boss rush, which orders the dungeon bosses according to that same numbering, regardless of the order you actually play them in, with the exception being it placing the Ganon fight at the very end. So for the sake of this video series, the order I will be tackling these dungeons in will follow that numbering. But when playing the game, you don't have to do it this way. In fact, I went to the Gerudo region first on my initial playthrough due to its proximity to the Southern Prairie, but I digress. That said, doing it in this order will provide a pretty elegant difficulty curve in most cases. With that out of the way, let's hop into the video. On the east side of Hyrule sits the usually calm Jabul Waters, home to the Zora tribe and the Zora tribe? The amphibious peoples of the River Clan and Sea Clan find themselves feuding, whilst unbeknown to them, their patron deity, Lord Jabu Jabu, has been replaced by a rampaging imposter. In order to mend both the rifts of the land and the growing rifts between these Zora leaders, we must enter into the still world once again and set things right. It is here, in the far reaches of the stilled Jabul waters, that we'll find the Jabul Ruins, Echoes of Wisdom's second or third dungeon. Previously, I described Southern Ruins as relatively simple, which fits the bill for the game's first dungeon. But compared to Jabul Ruins, Southern might as well be a lengthy labyrinth. Remember when water dungeons were complicated? And why is this dungeon shorter than the last one? But before we get too much into that, let's talk about some of the positives here. Firstly, this is a great looking dungeon. It's visually distinct and has a strong theming, a notable improvement over Southern in that respect. There's a blend of natural stone and man-made structure, or Zora-made I suppose, with plenty of plant overgrowth. It actually bears quite a bit of aesthetic similarity to Angler's Tunnel from the Link's Awakening remake, a dungeon I similarly praised. The walls have fish-themed engravings, including some larger carvings of presumably Jabu Jabu himself. There's also a strong visual tie-in to how the dungeon objectives are completed, with this visually striking central room having a large fountain with color-coded water spouts, and connecting lines linking back to the various corners of the dungeon with corresponding color-coded switches that activate them, which somewhat reminds me of the pipes that snake around Great Bay Temple in Majora's Mask, or the lines on the walls of the revised Water Temple in Ocarina of Time 3D. Point is, the place all makes visual sense, and is just pleasant on the eyes. The art team nailed it here. I particularly like these little flower lamps. Such a cute detail. The music is also pretty much perfect for a water dungeon. It frequently shifts between tranquil to these moodier and more dangerous sections. It's extremely fitting for a place that is presumably spiritual and serene for the Zora people, but is currently corrupted, having been ripped out of Hyrule and suspended in the void of the still world. That whole vibe is just captured perfectly here. There's a particular instrument used here that sounds like water dripping. It's such a great touch. Alright, but on to the actual navigation, which is just extremely simplistic. Its structure overall resembles that of a Wilds-era terminal-based dungeon, especially Breath of the Wild's DLC dungeon, The Final Trial, and to an extent, the Palace of the Four Sword from the GBA release of A Link to the Past as well, but not done with nearly the same level of finesse or creativity as those ones. I know that as soon as I say terminal dungeon, there are going to be people who assume that automatically is what makes it bad, but while I felt it worth pointing out that similarity in structure, I'd also like to point out that this is not the reason I didn't enjoy it. A dungeon in this style can work if it has creative enough obstacles, puzzles, or challenges in it. Again, see the Palace of the Four Sword, or more recently, the Lightning Temple of Tears of the Kingdom, which I quite enjoyed. Though I would be lying if I didn't admit that there is a certain style of Zelda dungeon that I tend to prefer, which are usually those with sprawling navigational challenges, the big Tangled Knot style dungeons. Jabul Ruins' segmented structure means that everything is separated into individual room challenges. Though there is an overarching objective to work towards, aside from those buttons and the main fountain in the central room, nothing in any one room really has an impact elsewhere. Nothing you find in one part of the dungeon will ease your progress through another part. But let's rewind a little. The first notable thing to happen in the dungeon is right here in the foyer. There is a section of floor that will immediately crumble, dropping you into an underwater section. It's here that a giant fish monster will unleash a little vortex attack, acting as a chase sequence. It doesn't last very long, but it is an exciting way to start the dungeon off. To be honest, I kinda have a soft spot for chase sequences like this. After that brief linear section at the start of the dungeon, you'll find the main central room, which, to its credit, is memorable and distinct. From here, there is a locked door and 4 pathways outward from the central room. These can be tackled in any order, and each one will activate one of these faucets, pouring water into the central chamber, which will in turn increase the height of the fountain's outpouring. In other words, more water equals more areas that you can reach. On paper, that sounds all well and good. A dungeon with a distinct central room, which the navigation all branches off from, having to explore every path to work towards a tangible and understandable goal. This should be great, if not for how utterly cheesable the whole thing is. In any other top-down Zelda game, the dungeon layout would be enough to prevent this, but Echoes of Wisdom has armed you with everything you need to break this dungeon into pieces, without having to go out of your way for any of it. Firstly, there is the Crawlchilla, which pretty well allows you to scale any wall without any restriction, meaning that the entire core gimmick of the dungeon, that being the need to raise the water level to gain height, quickly becomes meaningless. You also acquire the water block in the still world, which is an incredibly useful tool, but also trivializes most challenges related to gaining verticality or crossing gaps. Heck, if you know which part of the foyer floor collapses, you can entirely bypass that earlier chase sequence. And these are not echoes you have to go out of your way for to cheese the dungeon. The Crawlchilla is found in an area right by Luberry's house after Southern Ruins. It's almost a guarantee you'll encounter one of these enemies after the first dungeon. And the water block is found in the still world during this dungeon lead-up section. So, the entire dungeon ends up being pretty much undermined by the tools at your disposal. Had they shown some restraint, perhaps saved the water block for a little longer, perhaps even giving it to you as a useful mid-dungeon reward, maybe after a mid-boss that uses water attacks, like a dungeon item, then I don't think this would be nearly as much of an issue, though the crawlchula would still be problematic. That said, not everything in here is so bad if you take the time to actually explore everything. Each of the 4 pathways has a linear set of challenges leading to one of those switches, with a heavy emphasis on side-scrolling sections. I mentioned this already when looking at Southern Ruins, but the side-scrolling sections in this game feel a lot more intentionally integrated as thought-out parts of the level design, and this is one of the dungeons where that shows the most. It feels like nearly half of this place is set in an underwater, side-scrolling section, and I do find them fun to comb through while trying to manage your air gauge. There's some fun little individual room challenges here as well, which either involve combat, a bit of cleverness, or some creative thinking. This room, for example, has a strong water current, which prevents you from using those water blocks. I also like the way these paths all loop back on themselves, essentially giving you a shortcut back to the central room once you've completed the task in each route. That's a clever bit of design. But then, that's about it. The map and boss key are tucked along these various routes, but that's about the entirety of the dungeon. This is without a doubt the shortest and most compact dungeon in the game. Even the starter dungeon before this is more sprawling and expansive by comparison, which feels weird to me, like a regression in design. But once we've found the boss key in this little pocket of air and reached the top floor of the central room, we can unlock this door and confront the dungeon boss. This is Vocavor, who you may recall from that chase sequence at the start of the dungeon. I guess he's back to finish the job. Unfortunately, he's a bit of a pushover. This boss is not at all hard to take down. Vocavor does look pretty good though. They could have gone the route of making this just the anglerfish version 2, but they opted for something a little more distinct, with a weak spot that visually stands out, making the fight overall pretty intuitive. That's not a bad thing, and I don't mind an early game boss being a bit on the easier side. But I do think that the Seismic Talus proved to be a bit more of a challenge, so it's all a bit backwards. He'll mostly use those same vortex attacks, much like was teased to us at the start of the dungeon, albeit smaller here, with a few more physical tail attacks thrown in the mix as well. The strategy here is as you'd expect: send some echoes after his weak point, or attack it directly with sword fighter form. When all his weird little pustule things are burst, he'll be stunned and vulnerable. Deal damage, avoid his attacks, rinse, repeat. So, since his weak point is on his back, the fight becomes about avoidance and carefully positioning yourself and your echoes appropriately, which is good. There is also a second phase where the water drains out of certain parts of the room, which makes that aforementioned positioning a little more difficult, since you can't necessarily just swim there anymore. But again, with either a little bit of patience or the right echoes, this is still very manageable. And then he dies. Overall though, I don't have much more to say about Vocavor. Vocavor? I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. He goes down very quickly. I think he's a fine boss, but not a great one, which stings a little more after seeing how well the last boss was designed. And if you did the Gerudo Sanctum before this dungeon, like I did on my first playthrough, then you're really going to feel that plummet in difficulty curve even more. This is overall my least favorite boss fight in the game. It's not a terrible one, but I would rank every other boss in the game above it. So, Overall, Jabul Ruins is a pretty lackluster dungeon. There are some good things here. I like how the intro segment, after the foyer floor collapses, teases the boss to you. I like some of these puzzles that have you activating shock switches. I like the dark underwater section that makes both air and light a resource that you have to manage. But I think I would have preferred that they took a single idea, or even just a small handful of them, and fleshed them out in greater detail, because each one of these things is kind of a flash in the pan, or just a one-off thing. As it stands right now, I don't think I could put my finger on a single core dungeon mechanic or gimmick here, aside from it's a terminal-style dungeon. That ends up falling apart too once you realize that if you know what you're doing, you can skip almost the entirety of this dungeon, utterly breaking it apart. At least in the Divine Beasts of Breath of the Wild, you have to push all of the buttons. All you need to complete this dungeon is to scoop up the boss key from the northeast passage, and then make your way to the boss door. There's nothing stopping you from doing that and skipping the other 80% of the dungeon. It's a terminal-style dungeon where you don't even have to activate the terminals. I'm far from the only one to point this out, but to offer a counter to my own point, and a key piece of the argument that I think often gets omitted or glossed over, is that in order to do so, you have to know that that is an option. You have to have prior knowledge of where things actually are. Knowledge usually gained from actually doing the dungeon. So I'm sure most people didn't run into this as an issue. However, when you have the path to the boss key available so immediately, no matter how unlikely it is, it remains a possibility that this could end up being someone's experience in the dungeon, ruining it through the simple act of wanting to explore, something that is usually encouraged. So in the interest of being constructive, here's a couple of ideas that could have worked. These aren't original ideas either. I've plucked them all from other Zelda games, but I think these would work to fix the issues with this dungeon. One is that rather than a boss key, there could have been a giant mechanical lock that gets opened in segments by the 4 switches you have to press, just like the final trial in Breath of the Wild. You could also have a series of locked blocks or doors between the central room and the boss door, not unlike the lead up towards the boss of Key Cavern in Link's Awakening. Then, by spreading small keys throughout the dungeon, you make sure that players have to explore thoroughly. Or if that doesn't feel right, you could even just break the boss key into key fragments and scatter those around instead, a concept we've really only seen in the Goron mines of Twilight Princess, which I actually think would be better suited to an open-ended dungeon like this one, rather than the linear layout of that one. But in the end, what we got was a very short, mediocre water dungeon, one with loads of missed potential. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon, the names of which you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Again, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.